Good afternoon and welcome to our first November meeting of the Citizen Oversight Board. We've got an exciting agenda today and we're joined by the Executive Director of Safety, Armando Saldate. So I'm on my phone and I can't see you, Armando, but I assume you're here. Here you are. There you are. Okay. Great. All I can see is Daniel's face for some reason. Okay, well, let's kick off with some announcements and board business. First order of business is approving the minutes from our October 20th meeting. If folks had a chance to review that.
So moved.
Great. Great. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Motion passes. Couple of announcements. First is that Denver Health presented their 2024 contract to council on Wednesday. And as Daniel noted, there are not any significant changes to policies or practices included in that contract. So we know there is strong desire for change in terms of the level of transparency, particularly in Denver Sheriff's Department. With regard to complaints against Denver Health. And hopefully the administrator will get us there, but in terms of contractual obligations, there are no changes there. Another update is last week, the Monitor's Office published their semi-annual report. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to do that. I think one thing that stuck out to me that I chatted with the Monitor's Office about earlier this week is just the number of settlements and also the number of retirements of individuals who were in the process of being disciplined but left before their discipline was actualized. So that's kind of an interesting approach, and we know that state prohibits secrecy in terms of a person leaving while being disciplined and then being hired somewhere else. But, in some cases, this may have been before that law applies. So just something for us to note. It also became clear.
Julia, is that?
Yep, go ahead.
Julia, is that before? I thought that there had been some changes, and I'm sure we're premature with Armando, and he can answer this. I had thought that investigations had to continue, notwithstanding, even
right.
in Denver, notwithstanding the retirement.
Yeah, so I think that investigations have to be completed, but the discipline doesn't, have to be realized. So
I got it.
So
okay.
There's a record of discipline, but not fulfillment of that discipline, I suppose.
Right. Any appropriate discipline that would have been imposed had the person remained an employee of the city.
That's right.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. The other thing that I became aware of this week, and we'll talk about it with Armando when we get to that section, is that the disciplinary orders that are released by the city are on a monthly basis are released to the media, and they're released to us and obviously the Monitor's Office. But there's actually not like a database or a place where they're posted. It's just an email release. And I, in talking with a council member this week, learned that the council members didn't even know that existed. And so we'll talk about perhaps some process changes there to create a usable archive or database where, if you happen to miss the email, you could still find the information. So more to come on that conversation, I think, in the next half hour here. Last note is that Sheriff Diggins is not able to join us for our next meeting, which was as it was scheduled. So we'll meet with him in December, on December 1st. If anyone has ideas or requests for our November 17th meeting, please let me or Daniel know. Otherwise, we'll have more of an administrative meeting, which is also fine. Okay, any other comments, questions on any of those items? Okay, just a couple of other matters of board business. for Daniel's sake, are there any other comments or thoughts on the draft letter that we'll be sending to the Denver Police Department regarding the format of sorry, now I'm having a blank, like notices on the results of complaints?
I just a comment to say thank you to everybody who's like put a lot of work into it. Obviously, I had a chance to look through it. I didn't have any comments or edits or anything like that.
Okay. So if there are no further comments, we'll send that maybe today. Any other comments? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the most recent letter that Daniel circulated, right?
Yeah, Stefan, you provided some edits after the last meeting, which have been incorporated.
Okay, great. Thank you. And that's the letter that you'd like to get out on the Marshall anniversary, am I right?
No. Sorry, the two letters.
That's a different one. Different one. Yeah, different.
Yeah, we'll talk about that here shortly.
Right. I don't have any comments on the complaint process, and I'll look at the Marshall thing. I thought had a different deadline to it.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for the.
No, it's okay. I'll get to that in just one second. Any additional comments on the brochure? All right. Well, let's get that to print then. So now let's get to the Michael Marshall letter. So thank you, Daniel, for taking such a thorough first cut at that. It really came together nicely with all that research. When Daniel and I sort of talked about the form it had taken, we had talked about maybe a press release. We talked about, different format. But as the information came together, it was maybe more useful as an ask to council and the mayor's office than just sort of a blanket, like, here's a problem. And so I personally like how he sort of structured that. That said, we'll of course release it publicly as we release it to the mayor and council, if that's the approach that folks want to take. So a couple, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, the way that it's structured is a kind of a cover memo to say, here's a problem we've identified, which is that the non-financial elements of settlements are not being completed by the city, or if they're completed, no one can find them, which is a different problem. They're clearly not important documents then. And so then it goes through and sort of highlights different cases where we were unable to find those sort of non-financial deliverables, or we have good indication that they were never completed. And so it just sort of highlights the evidence of the concern. What we ask for in that is two things. One, a dashboard where there's some indication of like, what is the settlement total amount? What's the payment against the settlement or payment terms? What are the other deliverables and what's the progress the city's making on that? A dashboard is like not necessarily like the meatiest thing we could ask for, but it's a place to start. So if folks feel like that's kind of a nothing burger, we could ask for something else. And then what we haven't had a chance to talk about yet with the monitor's office is like having some level of reporting or transparency or notice to the monitor's office about matters related to settlements, because right now it is not required necessarily. I mean, it seems like it is required, but the way that the city has perceived it is that it's not required. And so some questions about like, if we're going to have disciplinary oversight in general of public safety, we should probably be aware of this as part of a structured process, and the monitor's office should be aware of that as part of a structured process. And so that's the second thing we ask for, is some process related to the monitor's office. So do look at the letter. Remind me, Daniel, we want to send it on the 11th.
So we have two timeliness options. The 11th is the 8-year anniversary of the use of force against Michael Marshall. If that ends up being too tight, or we want to push it back, he was taken off life support 9 days later, so the 20th would be another sort of anniversary day for timing.
Thoughts on the timing?
I did have a chance to look through this. I don't know if everyone else has. I again, I would, I guess, echo Julia, like, just really a lot of work has already gone into it, and there's a lot of really great research. So I don't see any reason why, with some tweaks, we couldn't get this out sooner rather than later. Is just kind of my thought process.
Other thoughts?
I agree.
Yep, agreed. I've looked through it, no changes.
I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but I will. But if we have 6 days to do that, I certainly should be able to do it within that time frame.
Okay. It's a pretty quick read as well.
Yeah.
So, and you know, Daniel did a lot of research. I have not fact checked his research. I trust his research. So if people feel compelled to double check the facts, that may take us more time. I feel like he's done a very good job in terms of, you know, uncovering the basics here. So if you have concerns about that or want to, you know, double, triple check, that might be something that extends our timing. Otherwise, we're in good shape. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts on that? Okay. Couple scheduling matters, and then we'll get to our special guest. Would folks like to do an in-person meeting with Sheriff Diggins on December 1st? Perhaps a visit to the jail. As part of that, I know many of you have already been to the jail, but in case that is of interest, wanted to put that out there.
Just a thought when you said visit to the jail, because I know they're making all those renovations to the Smith Road jail, which I have seen parts of just in my job. So maybe that would be, or they have a space there or something. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah. Daniel, did the sheriff have a suggestion on that?
No, not yet. I've confirmed that he's available during that time. We have not yet confirmed availability for an in-person tour. This is more exploratory.
Okay, just
if
gauging
this is
interest.
the board wants to pursue and request specifically, you know, the contact visitation center at the Smith Road County Jail facility should be opening here shortly. So that would be an opportunity to go visit that. And I know several board members have visited the downtown detention center, but I'm not as sure that board members are as familiar with the Smith Road facility. So.
Okay, so give that a little thought. The other question would be, would folks be interested in visiting the 911 call center for our November 17th meeting, given our recent conversation with the 911 director?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm open to it. I think we're like just getting back from NACOL, so that's fine.
That's right. Yeah. I know it's like all COB all the time. And so also if folks feel like I could use a break, I am going to spend 5 days doing COB stuff, we could also cancel that meeting. That's a perfectly acceptable outcome as well. So what does that feel like in terms of timing?
I would defer to everyone else, whatever everyone wants to do. I could see it either way.
Mm-hmm. You might be kind of fired up to get right to work once you get out there with other folks and hear all the stories.
All right. Well, if you have strong objections, just shoot me a text and we can manage that. Otherwise, we'll see if we can arrange a visit. Okay. With that, Armando, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. It's been quite a while. And I know there's been a lot of change and dynamics in the city. So glad to see you here. Thanks for joining us today. I know we sent you quite a number of questions. So if you want to start working through those, if you could, say the question out loud before you get to your answer, that would be great. And then let's just make sure we pause for board member questions. And then as I'm on my phone, if I don't see your hand, just like yell out, please, board members, and we'll make sure you get your question in. Okay, with that, welcome, Armando.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation to present with you all today. And thanks again for your submitting questions to me in advance. It helps me be prepared to give you answers I'm going to try to be quick and concise. So if you need more information, please, I'm more than willing, but I'd like to, I know we always kind of run out of time for all of them. So I'll try to get through as many as I can, or hopefully all of them. Any questions, please, yeah, let me know. And I'll try to do, and I'll pause in between questions. Also, just on the, I am happy that Andrew Dameron, our director from 911, was able to present to you all. I am excited about a lot of things going on there to help us improve what's happening out there, particularly around staffing and call response times. I will let them know, I'll just put it on tap for them that a potential exists for a November 17th visit there, just so they can be kind of prepared in case they do get that. So I'll go into the first question, and what is the status or the plan to acquire the public portal module for IA Pro? This was a recommendation in your 2022 annual report, recommendation 5A specifically. So let me just give people, especially the public on the call, a little bit of background and context to what this is talking about. So IA Pro is our case management system for our internal affairs complaints. So any complaint that comes in that is input into the IA Pro system, that's how they manage the complaint. It also is the storage mechanism for all those, and the system of record for all the evidence, documents, videos for those cases. It is also the portal that, or it's also the application that the monitor has complete access to oversee the cases and communicate, their recommendations and such. It is also, it's important to note that you all have access through your administrator, Daniel, to that case management software. I think I talked to you all probably over a year ago around IA Pro, which is, I also will note that it's the gold standard software for internal affairs case management. And as you guys go to NACOL coming up, I think you'll find a lot of your peer cities that work with it and utilize it. There's others out there, but I will tell you, I've worked with it in other jurisdictions, and it's the gold standard. With that, they are always coming on with new technologies, new systems, upgrades to their existing platforms. One of those being Blue Team, another one that we utilize. Another one being that they just had announced over about a year ago was a public portal module. And what it is meant to do is provide a portal for an online portal or web link or web address link to the public to submit complaints. And then literally it would go from that complaint process, whether that, and how I envision this, and I still envision this, would be that link would be available on COB site, the Office of Independent Monitor site, all our safety sites, and even on our main city site, there would be a link. If you had a complaint or commendation, you would be able to, as a citizen, be able to hit that link, go to it. What it would also do is right now, as we stand, when folks submit complaints, it's through various mechanisms. So it could come in from a jail inmate that writes a grievance, or a kite that gets sent through the process. It could also be sent via mail, and sometimes inmates in the jail send them via mail to the Independent Monitor or to my office or to the Internal Affairs, Public Integrity Division. It may also, be emailed, and there may be an email or a call that is taken over telephone that is put down in an email that's then sent across email. So there's a number of ways that these come in. Eventually, there's some administrative work that's done, whether it's an email, whether it's scanning a grievance, where it gets into a digital environment, and then it becomes uploaded into an IA Pro case. Obviously, the more complicated or how the routing comes in of that complaint, the more administrative burden there may be. A public portal like this, and what is exciting about it existing within IA Pro, is that once that is linked, it's already attached to the case management system. It's already given a number, a tracking, and then it could then be tracked much easier than having to go through the process of, and then the delays in that process of it sitting in someone's email inbox, it then having to go to, wait for time, and then finally get uploaded into IA Pro to get addressed. So this was an exciting new product. I had heard about it. I'd looked at it. I checked it on my own. I've been also had some of the folks on my team start talking with IA Pro as being an early adopter. It had just been announced. And then also the important things I have to figure out are what's it going to cost? No, these things aren't cheap. So I started doing that due diligence, started looking at what that might be. Well, then what also happened as of last year, and as we were discussing and doing this, is the significant pressures on the city budget when it came to the millions of dollars we're having to spend to shelter and mitigate the migrant crisis that is growing here in our city every day. That just really became an unfunded emergency that we were having to deal with our overall city budget. It's in the several $million now, and I think you're all familiar with that. That put a lot of pressures on my budget and everyone's budget throughout the city, to where projects like this that were unbudgeted, kind of foreseen projects, trying to get them prioritized in our project list or in our things needed to be acquired, had to take a pause. So that's where I'm at, really, and we're still in that situation. As you know, and as you've seen the 2024 budget, we meaning city leadership and the city council have identified a needs list that's really long around a lot of priorities, with softening sales tax revenue, a budget situation, inflation, and all those things. It's become much more expensive to acquire things like property and things. So long story short, we're still, what's impacting us and my ability to make this happen, because if I had the funds, I would have turned this on and we'd be going through it and hopefully it implemented this. We just don't at this point. So I'm going to continue, and hopefully as if there's end of year money, I will try to see where maybe we can find it. But and then also the pricing structure, I'm sure it's changed. It was much cheaper as an early adopter versus now. So I'd have to figure that out, but definitely open it. I see one hand, so I'll pause the question.
Yeah, can you just say, about how much was it when you looked at it before? And then is the city sweeping things like vacancy savings and other sort of buckets that you typically use?
Oh yeah, we've swept and we're now into contingency and reserve and all that. And in fact, we've held positions. We now have a long process to even fill a position, even a safety position. I want to say, and I'll double check these numbers and I'll try to get more current numbers. It was 20,000, I believe, as an early adopter. So I imagine that's changed, but I'll try to get a more updated quote on it to see what we're kind of seeing, if there is any funds at the end of the year or going into 24 that we can leverage.
Thanks.
There's not any more questions, I'll go to the second question. This was brought up during your discussion as we started the meeting. The proposed contract with Denver Health does not appear to include any changes to correctional care or required documentation to be provided to the city in the event of complaints or in custody deaths. Why is that? And this happened to be a recommendation in your all's annual 2022 annual report. So the contract with Denver Health, and just so people, when I refer to it, it's more generally known as the operating agreement. That's the operating agreement with Denver Health, and that is the city's contract with Denver Health for all the things that they provide the city. One of the many things they provide the city, as opposed to being in addition to being our safety net hospital, also helping in the space of public health and environment, EDPHE, and what they do there. They perform our correctional care through the jails. They provide correctional care inside our jail facilities, and we also have a jail portion or jail wing of the hospital, Denver Health Hospital on Spear and Bannock. So that is that operating agreement, and I don't know the exact number, but obviously several $1 million. It's very expensive. Healthcare is very expensive. You also may be familiar with Denver Health. That budget situation I talked to you about with the city is also one that Denver Health is going through as well, and they are trying to, especially coming out of the pandemic, deal with a lot of those things. Every year we start negotiations for the operating agreement, and we, as the Denver Health contingent, their leadership and legal team, the city attorney's office, our legal team, and then those of us in safety, public health and environment that are also all part of this. Denver Health. So this has always been, and as you remember, last year, one of our big, we went through an extended and contentious operating agreement negotiations around some of the changes we were wanting to make around what our firefighters could do and not do and all those things, and getting medical direction for our city. The nature of those negotiations is obviously confidential, but I will tell you, every time we get to the table, we ask for and we continue to try to always improve the service delivery, also while balancing costs and all those things, and trying to get the best contract for the city, and also trying to get the best services that we can get for our community. So we know, and we have heard, and Sheriff Diggins and I and other leadership in the city have voiced concerns around the in-custody care situations that resulted in death, or that where there was an in-custody death that may have had some outcome that was either controversial, or that was insufficient, or the subject of civil litigation. And you are familiar with that. Michael Marshall's one. We've had more recent incidents as well. So one of the things we did and we accomplished in our last negotiation was the jail administrator that Chairwoman Richmond talked about. That jail administrator position is a position of management within the Denver Sheriff Department. That position has just been hired. And what that person is a full-time position to look at and monitor the Denver Health's that they are consistently doing the practices that they're supposed to do, or when issues around inmate care or health care and those types of things come up, that they are that person for the city that is working on this full time to make sure we're getting those addressed and we're getting the information addressed. What also complicates this, though, is that when there are these types of incidents and when there are those types of things, there is a legal process. Typically, that is the catalyst is some sort of legal action, a lawsuit. And so that puts folks in other things like, the sharing of records and the transparency and all that kind of gets, they got put in that waiting period of the legal action. And I know there's some legal expertise on this call, but I think they understand that that's kind of what happens. And I know historically that's kind of what happens. We'll be wanting answers here. I'll be wanting answers, but we're kind of in a formal legal venue that we have to respect and go through that process. So yeah, there's a lot of it. The other thing about in-custody healthcare and our ability to have oversight over that, and our ability to tell them or be able to contend, are you doing the right thing or are you offering the right care? In the Denver Sheriff Department, in the Department of Safety, while we have a medical director, in those things, we don't have the medical expertise to say, well, that's not the course of care that should be, or that's not this or that, that's not that. What we try to do is we try to be in compliance with best practice. We are subject to, and I don't remember the acronym or the full name, but one of the accreditations that the Sheriff Department has is around correctional care. And so what we see and how that gets tested is through the compliance and our certifications around being accredited and trying to make sure that we are delivering care in the right standards. And there's not to say that there's never been, there has been real examples of failures in that regard, but we're always open to, especially on the city side, to explore those to make sure they don't happen. So long story short, yeah, we're trying to get the medical administrator role built to a way where we have more insight into these actions and where we can be more communicative and then more responsive and quicker responsive. But we also have to respect, the legal process around lawsuits and those types of things. And then we also, around medical expertise and medical decisioning, that is something we've contracted to them, and that we have to rely on the processes built in place, like around malpractice and all those things, that we can have the right kind of oversight for that. So any questions in regards to this one? All right, I'll go to the next question. Now we're shifting over to some DPD, a DPD topic. and not only DPD, but it's also something here in the Department of Safety that we work closely with them on. And that is asking about place network investigations. These are kind of referred to as PNIs or hotspots. Can you provide information about the place network investigation program and the PNI boards? Who serves on the boards, and how do they fit into the overall program? And has the program been successful? So I got some notes and some numbers here that we can follow up with an email. So y'all don't have to take, complete notes. I know probably Daniel has some notes here, but Daniel, if you want to follow up with Emily, we can provide these to you all later, because I'll try to get through them kind of quickly. So DPD has established 3 place network investigation locations. And those are Alameda and Federal, the intersection Alameda and Federal, 45th and Peoria and Northeast, and Colfax and Winta and East Colfax. And Winta, I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I've heard it pronounced separate as UINTA, and that's on East Colfax, or in the area of East Colfax. DPD, and it's based on a five years of violent crime data. Each of these initial P&I locations also are in areas of concentrated socioeconomic disadvantage, and how we know that is through census tract information and those types of data. DPD's main effort in addressing the inequity is reducing disparities and victimization of violent crime. And these numbers are a little lagging, but I'm giving you the most recent numbers that we have as of September 14th, so a little over a month ago. So at Alameda and Federal, one of the measures we have are days in between shootings. So say a shooting occurred today, we would then start the clock. So then the next shooting is, and that can be a measure of how performance is doing. So in before the project had initiated, there were 66 days in between shootings, which would, you would have expected 10.6 shootings since that project start at that rate. So at that rate, had we not had the project, there would be about 10 shootings in that time period. Post-project, there's been days in between shootings has been the highest point that or the most successful time that we've had was 459 days in between shootings, over a year in between shootings. The actual shootings that we've had were 3 in that time period. So a shooting reduction of almost 8 shootings. So that's one, and that's Alameda and Federal. The next is 45th and Peoria. Pre-project days in between shootings, we had 93 days that would have elapsed. That would expect about 7.6 shootings since the project started at this rate. Post-project, so since we've initiated the project, we've increased those days in between shootings to 187 days. There's actually been 3 shootings, and the reduction there is almost 5 shootings in that time period. And then lastly is Colfax and Winta. That is East Colfax, where we continue to have a lot of challenges on East Colfax. And then I would also extend those challenges into Aurora. That is one of those locations where, while we have a city border, the criminal activity doesn't really respect that city border. And there are typically on the other side of our city border, there is also problems with violence in East Colfax. Pre-project days, there was about a month in between shootings. We would have expected almost 23 shootings since the project had started this rate. Post-project days between shootings were only increased it about 13 more days, and that's 44 days. Actual shootings have been 16. So while the numbers haven't been as great, they have reduced shootings by a number of almost 7. This, combining the 3 total the locations, we based off the rates that were pre-shooting and then post-shooting, we'd almost have 19 shootings that are less than those. So what you can deduce from that is our P&I work was really has resulted in approximately 19 less shootings. Obviously, there's still more work to be done. 1 shooting is too many, but the evidence so far is trending in the right location. And that, especially given the police districts 4, which is Southwest, that's the Alameda and Federal location, and District 5, the one out in Northeast, 45th and Peoria, that was, those locations are really, we're finding really good reductions. And had actually the District 4 one that was some of the largest reductions we've seen compared to 6 different study sites. So I'll get into a little bit more about what the board is and about some of those sites. So the P&I board consists of director level appointees of most city agencies. So most of the city leadership are represented on these P&I boards, with the intent that issues related to blight and nuisance abatement and other kind of quality of life factors, streetlights, all those other things can be acted upon immediately if they contribute to the violence. Another way of saying that is, if we've had at 45th and Peoria, if we've had a streetlight that's been out, if we can bump that up on the project list for Dottie to get replaced, because specifically to try to reduce the violence, then having them on the board can help make that decision to make that priority. There's an academic evaluation that's tied to this. In fact, we've worked closely with Dr. Tamara Harold. Dr. Tamara Harold's a UNLV professor, a criminology professor. Her expertise is in this. This is actually something that she's developed. She is well regarded around the country and is a subject matter expert around the country, leveraged to provide this type of leadership. And we've had a close working relationship with her in having her oversight and administering the program. This project is being evaluated by a grant partner, and that is the National Policing Institute. And you all, I'm sure, might be familiar with them, their work and their research. They're going to issue a report later this year. The initial feedback is that Denver, especially that District 14 I talked about in Southwest Denver, has had some of the largest reductions in violent crime in a neighborhood under the study. And this is factoring in 6 different study sites around the country, other cities. So the next steps we have going on are the 3 P&I locations have been successful in reducing the crime. The plan is for police districts 1 through 5, so all of them, to have a dedicated P&I team to work on strategic level community crime concerns. With the new mayor administration, there will be new P&I board members, obviously because of some of the changes that Billy talked about, and so that we're going to hold a training in early December. That training will be conducted by Tamara Harold, who pioneered this approach. So the P&A concept is a central focus of our DPD's gun violence reduction strategy, and it's going to be something that we're going to launch in Montbello as a pilot, in particular in early 24. So that's kind of that. I know it's a lot of stuff. Like I said, the data we can get to you, or more information we can definitely get to you, Daniel, if you want to reach out to Emily and she can provide that stuff to you. So I think I see one hand up, or 2. Or did I not? We're good? Okay. Let's go to the Marshall settlement reports. So
wait,
the next...
sorry, I do have a question.
Oh.
I just was talking to myself on mute. Did you say there are any residents of those neighborhoods on the boards, or it's all city officials?
I don't know the answer. I can find that out.
Okay.
I would say I know that there is a direct and deliberate collaboration with the community. I don't know if that means that they're on the board. I will find that out.
Okay. If they aren't on the board, it might be a good way to directly engage them as well if decisions are being made there. And then, so blight can be a general term or a specific term. I have a building in my neighborhood that's been vacant for years and is boarded up, and I'm told if we submit a complaint that says it's blight, that helps us do something differently than what we've been doing. So I'm just interested in, like, is blight the specific term, or is it the general concept of blight?
Oh, no, thank you. That's a great question. So yeah, blight for me, and the way I used it here, is more the general term. It could be the blight of, like you just described, the boarded up, abandoned building that is unkept, that has, weeds, broken glass, all those things, graffiti on it, and just continues to deteriorate, unmanaged or unkept by the owner. And that's more that official blight thing. I'm also talking about the company that may be open, the liquor store that, has some of those same things, graffiti, folks hanging around, all that stuff that could cause that. So yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Yep. Well, so that it just kind of follows then. So that's determined based on the perspectives of the board, that is or is not sort of like undesirable.
Yeah, I would say it's not only the perspectives of the board, but it's also, I believe, I think it's looked at through the lens is whatever is happening there, whether it's a business that might be contributing or whatever's creating an environment where they're more susceptible to crime. So really what drives this and the attention to any location was those crime stat numbers, right? The violent crime stat numbers. And then what we try to do is, why is it concentrated in this location? And part of the evaluation, the part of using about the play space is we know geography plays a point in a lot of these things. I think we know that anecdotally. Like we could say, hey, that corner, there's always something going on there. That's always some activity. Well, what we know through criminology and through work that Dr. Harold does is that we know that there could be also environmental things that make it more susceptible. Lighting is the one that we typically, because that equate to, but also, you know, that boarded up building that has become an attractant for illegal behaviors, or that liquor store, or that whatever kind of thing. And so it's evaluating first the attention that's drawn there, and then evaluating the location of the why. Why has this become an environment that attracts, or at least makes it comfortable for these places to become violent crime hotspots?
Okay, great. And then maybe a more direct way of asking the question is like, what is the difference between this and broken windows policing? Can you sort of distinguish those things?
Different. But I'm glad that you pointed out that, because when you talk about hotspots, when you talk about concentrated efforts by policing, I think most people then jump to the conclusion of broken windows. And broken windows, for everyone on the call, was really a method of policing that was brought upon by NYPD, and them identifying crime hotspots. But the real difference here is in the response. So in that kind of broken windows response and policing, the response was high saturations of police and enforcement. So this meant that you would then send, okay, we have this hotspot, and instead of having directors, there wouldn't be a P&I board with the DOTI director or infrastructure director on there, because they wouldn't be part of the response. The response would truly be a law enforcement-based response around enforcement. And basically that enforcement is in broken windows is a zero tolerance. And why it gets its name broken windows is they're basically saying, even a broken window, if you let that kind of rest, then it turns into a much bigger issue. But like I said, the differentiation here with us and P&I is that approach is law enforcement, more of a real punitive level of approach. In this approach, it's also fixing the blight, fixing the windows, getting other involvement in it. Another big part of it is also getting engaged and community involved. One of the programs that we had that came from this was a mentorship program that we went and did direct outreach with children that live in these areas, and trying to identify them and hosting basketball camps for them to get into pro-social activity, as opposed to just going out there and waiting for folks to commit crimes there and then taking a swift enforcement approach.
And then, you know, a different way of looking at it is, if we look at these particular areas and they are bereft of investment, bereft of opportunity, is DEDO at the table, or are there other city programs sort of directing funds around opportunity? You know, you talked about infrastructure, that's one thing, but like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. DEDO's at the table. They're all involved, all these city leaderships, and where we can invest in community there, that's what we're trying to do, as opposed to just do a punitive kind of approach. That is what the deliberate strategy is here, is to engage in, you know, getting folks involved, investing in that community. Also, like I said, that's why we note that these are areas of less socioeconomic opportunity. So how we break that is we need to invest in that, and we need to channel programming there. And whether it's a DEDO program, or it's some sort of micro grant, or it's some other city service that we can grant there, that is something that we need to do. Any other
Thanks.
hand?
Question.
Karen, go ahead.
Director Saldate, if you will indulge me in a specific kind of question, you mentioned liquor stores, and you know it follows the old adage that there's a liquor store every other block, and in some areas that is true. What is your specific focus and practice around a liquor store that just seems to have an incessant problem with loitering, which kind of gives way to a culture of drug trafficking and other illicit behavior?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yeah, there's a number of strategies there. First, like around the loitering activity, around these becoming that zone from where this is where they go get their liquor, or this is where they hang out, or this is kind of the hangout. And then they may go across the street or to a grassy area across the street and then just start loitering, to where then there may become conflict. And then especially folks that might be intoxicated having conflict, and there may be violent crime. That is that cycle that we try to break. So first, we work with our community resource officers to then do directed outreach with the owner, talking to them about kind of the problems that are happening, what's happening, getting authorities to arrest for trespass and those types of situations, to tell, especially for property owners, or so that when officers do contact those folks, and if they are not, if they are loitering or creating problems, that there would be some mechanism to enforce them away from those zones. Secondly, is also to do with the licensing of those liquor stores. So with running a liquor establishment and doing that, they have to be very abiding by their licensing and their ability to sell alcohol. And so it's very stringent. So if we hear that they are selling liquor to underage students or underage minors, or they're doing things like selling tobacco to underage minors, or doing illegal things or selling illegal things, we will then target enforcement operations against those things, and that could put their licensing in jeopardy. Also, if there's crime associated with that, and if it reaches a certain level, that also can put their licensing in jeopardy. And when it comes to a liquor store, them having a liquor store and being able to make money, it's incumbent that they have a liquor license. So that's really where we need to, and that's really that concentrated effort of working with those store owners. The other thing is, we don't want to put people out of business. We don't want to do that, but we also want to say, hey, you can run a business, you can run a legal, safe business, but you also need to be a good partner in the community. And if these negative behaviors are happening around that, or if it's attracting of that, or by you doing something that you're not supposed to be doing attracts that, we need to make sure that we can police it. So those are some of the strategies we employ.
Okay, thank you.
There's no more questions. I'll go to the next subject, which is the Marshall settlement reports. So in Marshall, we're talking about the Michael Marshall death, who was an inmate in the custody of the Denver jail. So that died in custody at post use of force. Per the reported terms of the Michael Marshall settlement, this was the legal settlement case that came from that, the DSD was to make a variety of changes to policies and trainings related to inmate mental health. The city attorney's office was also required to provide reports on the DSD's compliance with those terms, with similar reporting to be included in the Denver Sheriff's annual reports from 2018 to 2023. Are you able to verify whether these reports exist? And if so, could you please share the reports with the board? And so what I've found in this regard is that the city attorney's office has confirmed that the necessary information required by the settlement agreements of plaintiff's counsel, those communications that they did provide that information to plaintiff's counsel. Those communications were directly provided to plaintiff's counsel. Sorry, my email inbox is pumping. And included regarding DSD's compliance with all of the obligations outlined in paragraphs 3A through F of the settlement agreement. Since those emails were exchanged between the CAO and plaintiff's counsel, we don't have access. DOS doesn't have access to them, but our special counsel and has confirmed that all the non-monetary responsibilities to which DSD agreed to as part of the settlement were timely complied with DSD. So that's where all those reportings were. The other thing is in regards to the annual reports. I believe All those annual reports are online, and that in 2018's report, there was specific information regarding the Marshall settlement and agreement, and I'm given a note that it was on page 23. The additional annual reports do not specifically refer to the Marshall settlement agreement, but all the reports do address what DSD is doing regarding the mental health of persons in custody, including the services provided by the mental health transition units and community partnerships. And beyond the Marshall settlement agreement, I think you all are familiar with and may have met Dr. Nikki Johnston, a psychologist that is the chief of mental health services in the jail. And that is a hire that Sheriff Diggins made and in part of this reform of mental health services delivery for the DSD and continued increase in programming for mental health treatment in the facilities. She's helped establish our crisis response team, a mental health step-down unit, and restoration and transition unit. So actually in the county jail, and I think some of you may have actually even visited this pod in the county jail. We also are now performing in our jails competency restoration proceedings and services and programming with Denver Health in our jail. So I'll then pause now for the question.
Okay, so what I understand from what you said was that the reports were complete, but they were provided to the complainant in this case, but they're not available either to DSD as deliverables that you could use to hold the sheriff's department accountable for ongoing behaviors, nor are they available to the public as a result of that, even though the remediation is really a matter of public concern.
No, okay. I definitely understand that. We were when they were trying to find this information and get the information, my understanding is that there was compliance to those reports where then I asked for those reports. Like I described, they were provided directly from plaintiff. We weren't part of that email chain or how that got involved. It was direct from city attorney to council. The attorneys that have worked on this case or had worked on this case historically are no longer with the city. When they went to go pull and find those records of those email correspondence, those were not retained. I think some of you or may, and those of you that are city employees on this or have a city email system, our email retention policies changed recently, or probably I think several months ago. And therefore, if you hadn't gone through the deliberate preservation of certain emails, they were automatically scrubbed from the system. Well, in those cases where they had attorneys that were no longer with the city, they were not kept in the city system, so they could not be retrieved. But we are working on getting that information and getting that out to folks and making it available. Yeah, I'd like to see it as well too. So.
Yeah, it also seems like a really strange record retention approach because my experience is anything involving the legal team is always on a legal hold. And so to delete those emails is a non-standard in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know that was a concern until I asked this about it, because that had also been my understanding of legal retention, was that those things that had been placed legal hold or legal proceeding in the city had already been marked in the background of the city. But I know you have much more expertise in that regard than I do. So yeah, that's kind of
that seems like a bigger problem that you have there too. The other question being, typically, many lawyers on this call, so if you don't take this approach, let me know. But typically you have a records management system on the legal side as well. And, legal deliverables are stored there as opposed to in email. So interested in that as well.
Yeah, I will too. I do know that the city attorney's office does have that. I don't obviously have access to that, but I will do more due diligence around trying to find out, was it stored in some other legal system or legal record system or record case files or anything like that. But as when I asked in regards to this question or in this kind of way, that this is the information I received to have a response for you today.
Okay, and then just sort of last follow-up. So this is what I'm to understand is that the city attorney's office transmitted these deliverables to the complainant in this case, and that DSD doesn't have those deliverables either in their sort of records or policies or anything?
Yeah, so that is my understanding right now. Now, reference policies, I will say that DSD has made, obviously a changed practice policy in response to this and how we do things. I mean, that is a matter of we have that we've seen that and as evidenced by the hiring and the organization that Dr. Johnston has set up and the continued kind of growth of that organization around our crisis response. So that does exist.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is really useful information, and hopefully we continue to, or hopefully we start having fewer settlements, and also hopefully as we will share in a letter both to you and to the elected officials, proper accounting with these deliverables matters to the public, because these deliverables are often where the systems change is supposed to happen, right? The money is a reparation-ish. I mean, I'm sure you can never sort of fill the hole that your missing loved one leaves, but from a system standpoint, having those deliverables publicly available matters, because those departments need to be held accountable to the outcomes of those deliverables, right? It's like this person experiencing a mental health crisis was murdered in the custody of the city, and we'd like to not have that happen again, right? And that is through policy, through process, right? And so, hopefully this sort of conversation starts, perhaps another conversation about a process that the city begins to hold itself accountable to the outcomes of these deliverables and also makes them public. Stefan, I see your hands up.
Yeah, look, I know there are some complicated legal issues here in the city attorney's office, obviously managing this, but just to try to, simplify this a little bit, I guess from my standpoint, a legal hold doesn't at all mean that information can't be disclosed. All that means is you shouldn't destroy or discard certain documents that are relevant to a particular dispute or litigation. That's all that means. That's what a legal hold is for, to preserve evidence. It doesn't mean that that it can't be, for purposes of transparency, certain documents cannot be disclosed to the public for compliance purposes.
Yeah, I wasn't stating that. So if you got that from my answer, I mentioned the legal hold in the just as you explained, in the retention of records. I see the reason that it wasn't given here.
Yeah. And I didn't understand you to be saying that, Armando. I just wanted to clarify that. But yeah, okay. All right.
Question.
Go ahead.
I'm mute, I guess not. In situations where there are terms of a settlement that require and agreed upon, that require changes in policy, do you feel like there's responsibility on the part of the administration in the law enforcement that the settlement pertains to, that you monitor and report out on the changes that are required by terms of the settlement, and you do that publicly?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's what we do in the cases that since I've been here, that's what we're doing. I'll give you an example. One was in regards to the protest reports where the subject of continued and still to this day settlements regarding to that. There was a formal report from the monitor, there was formal recommendations, and we in safety will also always provide formal response from that, and then also show what we've done. We continually talk about what we've done and what we've changed, especially in the response to protest and how we fundamentally overdid that. And we had our own, EPD had their own formal response in regards to that and continues. Also, as was mentioned earlier in this call, when it comes to audits that are conducted by our city auditor that the Department of Safety and of all our agencies frequently are subject to, are typically made, there's findings, and those findings are also reported on, and we're given timelines on when we change or do or fix whatever deficiencies noted. We're given a timeline, and then we're also provided a post, and then there's follow-up audits around our compliance there. So that is something that is typically done. In this case with Michael Marshall's death, we also, there were definitely deliberate actions by the DSD and the changes that were made in responses around these types of incidents. And so there was that. Now there's been some time between that time and when that happened several years ago to now, and understanding we're on an anniversary and understanding that those processes are continual. But I will tell you, especially in the timeline closer to when the event, there was a lot of public reporting, a lot of, I believe, feedback from the DSD and speaking with community and engaging around what changes were employed and what was continuing to be employed with DSD process.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this question? Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll head over to the next question, and that is in regards to another subject you all, or topic you all discussed briefly when you all first started the meeting, and that is the subject of records, discipline records, and how we get those records stored, maintained, publicized. So one of the things, so the question is, recently media reports have identified deficiencies within the publicly available post data related. Post is the Peace Officer Standardization and Training Boards. Each state throughout the country has a post. They are basically the certifying authority that makes sure that police officers are certified to conduct their duties in a state. So the post data related to discipline and certification of law enforcement officers. One news story led with the example of former DPD officer Shane Madrigal, who resigned while under investigation for very serious misconduct. The DOS ultimately found that the officer did violate policy, but the officer has a clean record on the Post online database. Is Denver consistently providing its disciplinary records and information to Post? If so, does that include findings made after an officer or deputy has resigned? So yes, we definitely do this. In the case of Shane Madrigal and the notifications, that one didn't go, as my understanding that notification was not made. I want to talk about this kind of general notion and I think Stefan, you pointed this out correctly, that it has been our policy before any of these laws are ever established in the legislature, in the state legislature. We in Denver have led the way on transparency around this and on practice around this without having been mandated by state legislature. First, we've always led the way in transparency around releasing discipline that has occurred by month. So all discipline, formal discipline, letters, actions, terminations, all that, those letters we release to the press on a monthly cadence. And we've done that prior to that ever being a mandate from anywhere else. Secondly, we made my predecessor, and I've maintained that, and I actually counseled my predecessor on this being a best practice when he did it. We put in a policy, and it's a directive of the executive director's office, that when and thank you, Chairwoman Richmond, for identifying this as a trend, that when officers or folks in our agencies are facing serious misconduct, there may be a resignation or a retirement in lieu of kind of situation. I will tell you that's not just unique to law enforcement or sworn agencies. I think any one of us in our work experience may have encountered that in a situation at a place of employment. However, in our work, it's important that this person just doesn't escape with, obviously we won't be able to discipline them, but the people need to know so that if they go into this line of work or try to go in this line of work somewhere else, they are still held to account and that they just can't just, get away from that kind of that investigation by retiring and getting hired somewhere else. That used to be a problem years ago. That is the terminology of gypsy cops, or folks that go from agency to agency, get in trouble at one, before they get disciplined, they quit, they go to another one, get in trouble, that. And so we've done things very intentional around not doing that and not allowing that to happen. One of the ways that we can do this, and that's now mandated by Post, is that there is reporting to Post, as Post would have to certify an officer regardless of what agency they worked at here in the state. So that is something. So when an officer has retired or resigned, like in this situation, prior to the case being adjudicated or discipline being, or even finished or completed, here in Denver, our practice and our policy is that investigation is completed through the end and fruition. The independent monitor still has oversight over that case, can make recommendations. We complete the process effectively without that person. We will then offer even that person, if they hadn't been interviewed, we'll offer them the opportunity to interview. They're under no mandate to interview because they're not our employee anymore, but we will complete that process. We will also then say, if this person had been here, this would have been, let's say, subject to 10-day suspension or termination, or maybe even not sustained if that had happened, right? And based off the evidence that we have and the completed investigation. Where we've seen this, and this is still a relatively new process, and now that we're seeing this take hold in the legal field, in the legal process, is we also have now former employees who have appealed those decisions or appealed those disciplinary decisions. And in cases, and I'll give you an example, and in a case where those decisions are made in the civil service process because they're a civil service agency, and that would be DPD or DFD, they have filed appeals to that, saying, let's say an officer quit before their, or retired before their discipline. We came out with the finding, we reported that discipline as it was, let's say it would have been termination. We've had officers now retire, then say, well, we appeal that. They appeal it to the Civil Service Board. The Civil Service Board has now come up with there's the legalities whether they even have standing to appeal because they're no longer a civil service member. So those are the kinds of things I want to say. This is such a new kind of area that we're delving into. And I don't think those cases have been resolved yet in the courts, but so these are new kinds of things. But I want to tell you that these are new kinds of things that we started, that we're the ones doing, and we consistently are doing. So I know I talked a lot about that. I also just want to talk a little...
Before you move on, Stephanie, you have a question?
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned this, Armando. I did not realize that somebody who tried to avoid discipline due to alleged misconduct still had standing to appeal to the Civil Service Board and ultimately to the court on and I realize this is a legal question, but boy, that really surprises me how you can, how you can avoid discipline, but still appeal the discipline that would have been imposed had you still been an employee. It just seems, it seems like they would completely lack standing. I know I'm not asking you to render a legal opinion, but I was not aware of that. Is that is something that is still being considered? Is that an issue that's being considered by the courts right now?
It is. It's something that has not been resolved in the courts, but it is something that the city are having to respond to now based off that direction.
Okay. Thank you. That's unfortunate. Yep. Okay.
A quick follow-up question on that. So in my experience in a different city, we had an officer who was, disciplined in a, sort of at the higher end of the matrix and had so much time off banked that they were put on, administrative leave, were able to get paid for the duration of their time off. And then, this sort of discipline was applied at the end of that. And the case of this officer, it was like a year worth of time. And so no longer on the force as a result of the discipline, but still on the force and on the payroll for a year because of the PTO. And so is that something that gives them that standing, like they're actually still hanging around in the background, or can you say a little bit about that?
That's not the situation here. They have actually separated from the city. And I'm not exactly sure how our payout is for officer PTO, but I think it's not actually in time, it's actually in a payout. It has like leaves with remaining leave balance.
And even in the case of discipline, because that is contractual versus, so even though you were not a good steward of tax dollars, you're still getting extra tax dollars at the end of that.
Yeah, and then just lastly on this topic, I wanted to just note that, you know, I hope you all, and obviously me and Chief Thomas, this is transparency is key issue for us. We try to lead in our decision making and try to be as transparent as possible in these situations and try to lead with that in our decisions and all that we can. And so I hope you know that, you know, part of what we've done recently is around making our discipline forward facing and discipline kind of dashboards that you talked about, Chairwoman, about, you know, that trying to make it easy for the public to see how we're disciplining and where we are. That also brings up the point that you all talked about before. And this is a question that I'm still grappling with is in a policy we'll still, you know, and so I'd love to hear your feedback on this, is the question as to do we create a permanent public facing link record of that discipline to where that discipline letter, let's say Armando's gotten a discipline for who knows what, and he'd given a 10-day discipline hit, and that letter and that discipline letter resides on the internet in an open forum for all to see all the time without a time limit. That is balanced with, I think, because we have obviously serious discipline that is subject to news reporting and forever living in the ethosphere of the internet. And then we have folks that make mistakes. We're all people. We've all made mistakes, right? And should that discipline letter continue to be in a legal way to where it's always following them as to like, hey, I paid my penalty. I did my suspension. I mean, we have several officers that come in and say they take responsibility for their actions. They do that. And this thing's constantly following me around every day. And I'm kind of linked to this all the time because I made a mistake in the past. So there's a balance there around that and those concerns. But I also understand there is a public need to know around serious misconduct and that being out there as well. So I do want to tell you those are kind of issues that I am, you know, considering and working on. Is there any questions in regards to that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get you don't want to create this like negative record. You know, I didn't do my training on time and now I've got this thing on the internet that's, you know, really talking about that. So really understand that. And, you know, many of those things could be anonymized except at request or something, right? Like, I think for me, the thing that seems missing here is that each month, you know, there's like 10 to 20 of these things published. No one's looking at trends. No one can, you know, like if I pulled all these together, I could see that over the course of a year, you know, there are many cases of officers like missing their firearms training or something like that. But like, if I actually had that data in a usable format, I could see, you know, it's really first year officers who are sort of overwhelmed with their jobs. And so, you know, we really need to do X, Y, and Z thing to help accommodate the training that they need to take. Or it's really tenured officers who feel like they've got it and they don't want to do that training. And so it feels like extra to them, or, you know, whatever that is, like there's no system level data here. It's just all sort of like these data points that get, you know, published into the ethos. And so, you know, if I was the leader of this, I would think that would be useful in terms of planning and sort of strategy for my organization. And then from a public standpoint, you know, if we're looking at increases in officer involved shootings or, you know, increases in, you know, aggressive contacts or something like that, like I can't tell that because all I've got is like this, you know, real-time data. And I can't see sort of what's happening over time unless I create that database, you know, sort of myself. So from that standpoint, you know, the public transparency is not just the one-off, it's really about the structures that support those behaviors. And so that for me is sort of what's interesting about, you know, creating an archive that's not just PDFs on a website. Stefan, I see you have a question.
Can I answer answer those points quickly because I think it's important. The fact that I disagree with that, we're not doing that. We are doing that. The fact that it's not facing publicly is that, but we also have an independent body that does that, and that's the independent monitor. She does that. She has very smart people. She has folks in her spot that do that deliberately, that are doing that all the time. They issue formal reports, semi-annual and annual, in regards to all those things. We also meet on a quarterly basis with DPD and the PID and DSD in my office to do just that, where we're looking at, and they're trend meetings. They're talking about what are we seeing in trends, what are the kinds of things, all the way down to your example of, are they tenured officers or are they not? We've identified that we have a year of a class in DSD where we see a disparate amount of misconduct cases. So I will say that I agree with everything you said, other than the fact that we're not doing it. We are, and we're doing it deliberately. Now, can we do that publicly and show that? We're also trying to show that publicly by showing, I mean, the data that we put on our transparency sites online are not just point in time data. They are trends. They do go back some time. So I just wanted to comment on that. Sorry, Stefan, to interrupt your question.
Yeah, that's great. And, you know, of course, it's the monitor's role to hold you accountable, but it's not the monitor's role to manage your organizations and ensure that there's sort of continuous improvement, right? So that's where, you know, you said that you're doing it, and so that's great news. But you know, it's comforting to the public to know that that's happening as well. Go ahead, Steph.
Yeah, Armando, you made an interesting point on balancing this in terms of officers, you know, accepting responsibility and then having some concern about, you know, a particular area of discipline that follows them around perhaps for the rest of their career. I guess I get that. And I hadn't thought about it that way, but and it's a good point. I guess I look at it from a couple of different standpoints. I mean, sure, I think, you know, we have to be fair. Look, people that, for example, have criminal records, you know, early on in their lives, they don't like the fact that follows them around when they're looking for jobs or a variety of different things. So I get it. I mean, you're kind of analogizing it to a misconduct situation, you know, for a law enforcement officer. I would push back a little bit on that, in that these folks are public servants. And so I think that the public does have a right to know about, you know, misconduct or violations that have been found about somebody that's supposed to be serving the public. But I take your point about, you know, the seriousness of certain things. I don't know, you know, for example, in terms of, you know, consistent disclosure throughout, maybe going to Julia's point, it's a little different on data. Maybe you establish criteria as to the seriousness of a particular act of misconduct. And those are the things that, you know, frankly, never go away. And perhaps you establish that criteria in terms of the level of disclosure, the extent of disclosure, and the like. But I can see arguments both ways there in terms of somebody being a public servant, and it'll always be disclosed. But anyway, I just throw all that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. And again, I agree with what you said. And to the point of what we're doing, we are doing it and making that public disclosure immediately within the month that it's administered with their name, regardless of the level. If it's formal discipline, it gets published, right? And we do that proactively, like I said, and we've been doing that for some time every month. That lingering, should it always retain in a record or repository where you're tied in the same link where folks with really serious misconduct or not. But I also I really appreciate your input around establishing criteria, because it's something I've discussed internally here with my team is that kind of one of the parameters, the seriousness. And we do have conduct categories, so that could be something that we could affect with policy around that. So thank you for that info.
Yeah, just sort of following that thread, right? Something is maybe not serious until it is. And so what I mean by that is, like, I don't take my firearms training on time. I don't take my firearms training on time. I don't take my firearms training on time. And then I have an officer involved shooting that is, you know, clearly out of policy, right? And so it's like, it doesn't matter. That's a very low level offense until it's a super big problem because somebody's been hurt, right, as a result. And so, you know, that's where it gets a little tricky, is like, sure, I make a mistake, but like I make a perpetual mistake or a persistent mistake. And then that becomes, you know, someone's life or someone's, you know, well-being. So, you know, there's a lot of sides to this, but, you know, sometimes the individual problems become, you know, really big problems.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's another parameter I think is a good idea to explore around patterns of conduct, what we would call what you just described, and how that can maybe be one of the parameters for disclosure publicly. So thank you for that. And I think, Daniel, I think we kind of answered 6 on this. And just so everyone knows, our on question, the next question we had was, does DOS regularly share department orders of discipline with the media as a result of core requests? Does the DOS maintain a public online database of issued disciplines? If not, would you consider creating one? So I think ultimately I answered yes. I'm definitely considering, we've been considering how we do that. We're talking about it, and then input like I received today from you all, and continue dialogue. And obviously I would have dialogue and input from independent monitor Castle and her team as well.
Before you move to the aid center questions too, I recognize we are well over time with you, so hopefully you did not have a meeting that you're lot to catch up on, clearly. So maybe you could answer the aid center questions sort of all at once, and I'll summarize the questions, and then you can do that, and then we won't leave time because we're already over time, but we will allow time for panel board member questions in case there are ones that aren't here. So the question is, there were, when we learned about the aid center, which is intended to be an alternative to putting people in jail, there were sort of low-level rates of deterrence into the aid center by DPD at first. And so we had talked about, perhaps there were barriers or concerns from officers in terms of using that center. So have any changes, taken place over time is the first question. The second question is, there have been some grants that the aid center has received. And so that was intended to expand services. Have those services been expanded? And then there was some warrant clearing activities, an event at the aid center last Saturday, and just wanted to know how that went.
Great, thanks for summarizing that. So hopefully, and you guys have me as long as you need me or until you guys run out of time. So yeah, thank you for all those questions. I'm always excited to talk about the aid center because of all the great work going on there. So first of all, around DPD kind of increasing their participation in deflecting or diverting arrest and utilizing the aid center as that diversion kind of tool to get people connected. And from my perspective, it's very important, particularly a lot of these low-level offenses that DPD deal with daily and day out is in my view, rooted in public health, especially around substance misuse or untreated mental health. So those are the things that we've encouraged. We're working with our LEAD program, our aid center folks doing ride-alongs with DPD, particularly their homeless outreach teams, to make sure we can increase that. Also, I want you to know that this is one of the highest priorities, just this approach to law enforcement, public health approach to law enforcement and criminal justice by the mayor and Mayor Johnston's administration. So there are an ongoing set of policy discussions around this, around just that whole diversionary process prior to a jail booking that I'm engaged with at the highest levels of the mayor's administration and system stakeholders like the courts, the DA, the municipal public defender, and others, to try to see where can we establish policy here to understand and identify just what you talked about, Ms. Rickman, around those barriers of what could be, or is it process, or is it legal, all those things, trying to make it, because I think everyone, and that's the good place we're in, everyone wants to divert a booking if we can make a connection or a public health intervention. That's everyone's fair, so that we're working hard on that. Those 2 grants you talked about are obviously, we need resources to do that. One was a Caring for Denver grant, the other one was a Bureau of Justice Assistant grant. Both of those can help us increase our programming, our ability to do so. They are right now through the grant legislative process of the city. So how that happens is we get awarded the grant, there's award letters, we then have to prepare this to go in front of city council to accept those funds and how we're going to accept them and the oversight and all that of the funds. And so that process is underway with both of those, but we're hoping all those processes, including going in front of council and being subject to safety committee and their inquiry around that and reporting of that, is hopefully going to go on. They're a little busy right now with the big budget, but hopefully we'll get this going before the end of the year. We'll get in front of them to get these in place. And then lastly, I'm very excited to talk about the Fresh Start program, which is a warrant clearing event at the Aid Center. This is the second one the Aid Center has hosted. And first, I want to note that the Aid Center has become a trusted community environment, not law enforcement oriented, thus the participation that we've had in something like a warrant clearance event. The first warrant clearance event we had was this past summer. I think it was in July. It was a pilot, and this, I really got to give kudos to DA Beth McCann. She's really initiated the work here, really kind of set up and got all the stakeholders involved. And I really have to express my appreciation for the Denver County Court, our judicial officers and their administration. They've done the lion's share of the heavy lifting here, and our public defenders. Not only our municipal public defenders, our state public defenders, Office of Legal Services, all of them, everyone's come together. And then our partners at the Aid Center, these are our service delivery partners that come there literally volunteering their time to try to get these folks that come to these events connected to services as a way of taking care of these charges and the warrants in some cases. And in a lot of cases, they're able to not only clear the warrant, but disposition their charge and the whole status of the case by getting hooked up with services. So the first warrant forgiveness event, I want to say we're around 50 or so participants, equaling around 75 cases, I believe. Those are estimates. That was in July, first event. That first event we thought was such a success. Let's do it again in the fall. Want to do these at least twice a year. So we planned this one, got it. Despite that Saturday that we had it last Saturday, having extreme cold, snow, all that, we were worried that would impact it. If it did, we would have had more problems than we would have had too many people to deal with. But we had 134 individuals that came in. 91 of those folks were able to get a warrant cleared or participate in the process and be seen in court, which represented 145 cases because individuals had multiple cases. It breaks down to like 73 of those cases being municipal, 39 being criminal cases, and 33 being traffic cases. The other 43 people that were there, I want to say that it's not like they didn't get any service or any help. They got connected to our services, got those offerings, but they also got the information on what their existing warrant was. And the reason they weren't, let's say, able to be seen there is because that warrant existed in another jurisdiction. So we were prepared for that to happen. So we had those resources. So let's say if it was a Jeffco warrant, we had the information for them to contact who to contact in Jeffco for a similar program like this. So really a great event. We've already had a debrief on Wednesday of this week about lessons learned. Obviously, the volume of people, the way they came in, how they came in, how we processed, we got to do some process improvement stuff. But the problems we were discussing were good problems to have because they're driven by the volume of people coming in and our ability to want to do it. I'll give you an example. From 9 to 2 is when we were scheduled. We started letting people in because the line was forming and it was cold. By 8, we started letting them in. We got there a little before 8, our staff. We started seeing people out there gathering. It was cold, so we started bringing them in around 8:15. And then we didn't stay until just 2. The court was seeing cases up until 5. And so, and people stayed much longer than that. So obviously a very good event. Each one of those cases, the warrants that were cleared, to me, the way I can equate it to, it's not a booking in jail, right? And we got someone help, we got someone engaged with some services and all those things. So excellent event. I'm glad I talked about it. And I have a few minutes to discuss the last question if you want, or if you have questions now, I can answer your question.
Yeah, let's, Stefan, I see you have a question. You're on mute.
You're right. I had to press 2 buttons instead of 1. Armando, you may have answered this already in your explanation about the Aid Center, but one of the things that we have been concerned about is the hours of the Aid Center and the fact that it's not open during the evening hours when some of these low-level issues could arise where people could be diverted from custodial situations. Are the grants that you mentioned, if you're able to land those, will those be helpful increasing the hours of the Aid Center, particularly for overnight use by DPD?
Yes. So one of the grants we specifically were hoping to be able to expand some coverage or programming into the evening time into that. As I've told you, I think in the past, if I could open it 24/7, I would. We're trying to get that kind of ability to do so. That's one of our driving initiatives, is to have it available and at all hours of the day. So that is something we're working towards, and we're hoping the grant can help in some way to do that.
Okay. I see that Larry has a good question in the chat, Julia.
Yes. Hey, Armando. Just related to, and it's kind of in the question that was that were summarized. It looks like there's been some previous concerns by officers related to being able to use the aid center. Has there been any ongoing surveying to see if there's been any changes related to that? And also being able to address those officer concerns?
Yeah, it's not done through surveying. We're actually doing direct contact with those officers and those folks that work in this space more often and not. We have folks riding along with them. We have, continued not only with the officers, but also the command staff and the leadership here at the department to make sure that we understand what are those barriers, we understand what are those understandings to where we can increase the utilization and do that. The other thing, and it's ultimately also that aggravates this, is just the staffing and all those things that we're trying to address with DPD, right? We got an overwhelmed department with just call volume, and we're trying to make sure that from a number of ways we're giving officers ways to do their jobs more efficiently and get them to be able to process the workflow, and then obviously add more staff so that we can have officers that have time to sit there and not just make a quick Band-Aid approach to something, but if someone needs a public health approach, and whether that's at the aid center, the solution center, or some other intervention, that we have the time and staffing to be able to complete those outcomes as well.
Great. Before we go on to the next question, Monitor Castle, do you have many topics to discuss, open investigations in executive session, or just want to make sure we're balancing our time?
Just cover what we covered on Monday.
Okay, so maybe we can do that pretty quickly.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, great. So with that, Armando, if you wouldn't mind sort of asking out loud and then answering the last question on there.
So the last question, and thank you for this question, because it is something that I think the public needs to understand and that we're working hard to get folks understanding. So what's planned role of Denver public safety in relation to micro communities that the mayor's administration is building? So everyone, get everyone on the right so that we're talking and everyone understands what we're talking about when we say micro communities. So around the initiative that the mayor declared an emergency on first day of his term, and was House 1000. And this was the recognition that we are in a state of emergency when it comes to our unhoused neighbors, and that we have, at the last point in time, we have close to, I believe, almost 1,600 documented folks that are living unsheltered in our community in the city and county of Denver. So around that, and we see that, we all see the harms that has had to not only those folks that live in those conditions, but also the communities where these encampments are, those types of situations. So the mayor around this, as the approach has been in moving these encampments, is the decommissioning of encampments. As you all know, before, how we dealt with these when they got really bad, and encampment got really bad, we did a cleanup of those encampments. We then cleaned it. A lot of times it was just displacement that would occur. We cleaned up an encampment in one block and just relocate to another block. Sometimes it would relocate to across the street. Other times, even worse, it would just come back once the fences were removed. So really with the intention around trying to find another place for them to go that is more stable, safer, cleaner, well-managed. And we've done that as a city before, but in smaller numbers. And we've done that with safe outdoor sites. We've done it with micro communities or tiny home villages or those types of sites. We've also done it as we've acquired, let's say, hotels or other types of properties where we've worked with another community partner to try to get shelter things. We all know the feeling and effects that there's not enough housing in Denver, affordable housing for folks. So this is very hard to do. So that's why all these alternative kind of ideas are being put in place. So micro communities, the mayor's office and the team working on this throughout or published about 11 sites that they had proposed be the sites of these micro communities. What was also important is that we don't concentrate all this in one area. Like right now, these problems are over concentrated downtown or even in our northeast corridor kind of area. Is making sure that this was spread around all the council districts and in places. And so we identified as what we could identify as proposed locations. We also, and I think it's important everyone know, we, and I say we because I've been part of it, the mayor, his team that work in this space, particularly his senior advisor on homelessness resolution, Cole Chandler, me, the police chief, the fire chief, the sheriff, all of us show up at these community town halls and community information meetings. First, we've gone to over 40, I believe, where we've talked about this with community, and then we've talked about these proposed sites with community, not without serious debate about whether this is the right place for them or not. To that point, 2 sites that were considered that were the subject of a lot of community feedback and input, criticism, to be honest, have been pulled off the table. So one was right here in the Golden Triangle, 1199 Bannock, and one was at Yale, on Yale in Southeast Denver. So we're listening, trying to do it. What residents' chief concerns are, or neighbors that are living next to these, or businesses that are next to these, is by having these locations, you are inviting crime, blight, all those things that you don't want to have. And so that NIMBY, or not my backyard mentality, is kind of out there in some of these places. What we will tell you and what the data tells you is when these sites have been put in place, and I talk about like a safe outdoor space or a pallet shelter, or a tiny home village, the data from our call data, partner safety call data, whether it's police, fire, or both, shows that that's not the case, that these locations can be well managed with little problems, and that they don't increase the call volume or become an attractant for negative behavior. That's what we know from the data so far. Because they're managed, they have facilities on site, they have programming, wraparound services. So, but there does need to be a security component. So as these are being built, we're identifying in each one of these, what does that look like? And we, meaning the Department of Safety and our safety agencies, like around medical response and around security and police response if needed. And so we're working with that. Also, each one of these micro communities will be subject to the Good Neighbor Agreement, which talks about it's kind of a contract with the neighbors, like, hey, this is what we abide and what we're going to do to make sure that all those worries you have about, all those concerns you have about that aren't going to happen. And if they do, this is how we're going to take care of it and how we're going to address it. So to say we are very engaged in it, either we're at the Emergency Operations Center with my staff in the planning, identification of these sites, also around the permitting that's needed. Fire department, talks about whatever's needed from fire department response for these sites to operate safely and that would be available to accept, emergency response. And then also from the security component around what kind of security is there. My ideal situation is that we don't need police officers posted there or any kind of full-time duty there, that hopefully we can either do it with the management on site or with private security. And then if there is a need for police, that we have good communication over like what our involvement is and what we're doing. But I don't anticipate, just based off our data, that these places are going to be attracted to all what people fear in them. And I understand that fear, I get it. And I definitely appreciate their concerns because I don't want that to happen either. Hopefully that answered the questions, but I encourage folks, especially if you have community on the calls, to go to these community information meetings as we're rolling them out, as we're talking about them. We're having very good dialogue with the city. And like I said, not everyone agrees, and some people are very critical of them coming to their neighborhood, but I think you'll see us show up and we'll hear your concerns, not only from the mayor's administration, but also from our safety department.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning too that I live in Council District 7, and mine will probably be one of the first in the city, the micro community in my district, and it was an encampment before it's becoming a micro community, and so for me that was really helpful framing in that, like, they're not putting this in the middle of Wash Park, for example, right? It's like a place that people were living there anyway, and now we're creating a safer place for them to live. What is also maybe worth mentioning is that the people who were living in that encampment before are not necessarily being moved into that micro community once it's built. There's some amount of sort of like moving people around the city based on needs. So that is a little bit more complicated picture, but appreciate that. I think there'll be a lot more conversation about this, obviously, as this approach rolls out citywide, but thanks for touching on that. Any other questions, comments from board members for the executive director?
One question.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
With the latest sweeps or whatever they're being called now, have there been any arrests?
Not that I'm aware of. So the cleanups that have occurred, the actual two latest ones that we've done, in fact, were decommissioning, and that was where we were taking them and then moving them to one of these shelter type of environments that we talked about. And we've had, so that is right here in the downtown area. I have not known of any arrests that were made at any of these cleanups that have reached me, but I can check on that, double check on that, but I don't think there have.
Were any diverted to the AIDS center?
No, in fact, these locations were actually sent to the micro communities we were just talking about. So there, we were slated to move. We targeted an encampment that was 50, but there were 63 folks that wanted to be housed. So this, like I said, was that permanent decommissioning. Any other of the cleanups that are done, those cleanups are done in coordination with a lot of, when there isn't a place for them to go, or like a decommissioning like this, there have been a couple of other cleanups that we've had to do for health and safety. In those cases, they're connected with, in that week and in that posting period that we have, that week of posting prior to that cleanup being done, we have them connected with case managers, outreach case coordinators from host and others. And if they needed the aid center support in that, or the servicing there, that is one of the many things in their tool chest to try to help people navigate to their next location.
Okay.
Terrence, I see you have a question.
No, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you all.
I saw Tymisha, you had a question in the chat. It was just, about how many encampments do we think there are in the city, or maybe a range estimate?
I don't have that number on top of my head. I know this is something we're tracking and we're trying to track, but it's also a moving number, right?
Sure.
So I will try to get that. I'll try to see if I know that the Emergency Operations Center does try to track that general number. I think I was in council not too long ago where that came up. Also, we need a different, there's also like the official, like what people say, how many make an encampment, a super real
right,
encampment.
versus like a tent on Spear. Yeah.
So like a single tent on Spear, I don't think is denoted into that number. So I'll also try to find the number for you, Ms. Watkins, and the parameters of what makes up that number, because there could be like someone sleeping in their car right now that is technically camping somewhere, but they're not part of that. So I'll try to get that for you.
Great. Or a line of people sleeping in their cars. Go ahead, Terrence.
Yeah. Director Saldate, I was just thinking about this. I mean, there's a lot of, I don't want to call it propaganda, but there's a lot of, on all sides of this. For instance, on Instagram, there's a group that says "Do Better Denver," and they like to track, crime and things like that at encampments. And if you look at their thing, there's some craziness going on every day at an encampment. And so my question is, does your office keep track of, as a separate issue, actual crime at encampments? Do you, in terms of calls for service, what's happening there, things like that? Because one of the things that I saw was when I live downtown. I'm not going to say where I live downtown simply because we're in a public thing, but I live downtown, and Stephen may try to come over and take a picture with me because that's what he does. But do we keep track of, crime as or calls for service as a distinct place from encampments? And I'm not sure if I made sense, but hopefully I did.
Absolutely made sense, Mr. Carroll. Yeah, we do. We every police district, everything, we're led by data, and data really helps lead, especially our resourcing. So we definitely look at address level data. Where is crime occurring? Where it gets difficult to put a number of, or to make an equation that says this encampment equals an exact number of crime is tough, because how do you say, because I will tell you what some neighbors will say is that camping across the street, and ever since that encampment across the street, I've had my bike stolen and my house broken into and my TV stolen. Well, do we directly correlate without any other evidence that that was done by someone that was at that encampment? So it's hard. What we can generally say is we can look not only, and I think I saw in the chat a question about this, but we can see what's happening there at that address. We can then take it out even wider and say what's happening in that radius. And then we could put timing on. Did crime generally increase when that encampment was there? But to make the direct correlation that the cause was that encampment is pretty hard to do unless you can say, I saw a guy get out of that tent, come over to my house, break into my shed, and steal my bike, right? That's the hard part, to really differentiate that data. But there's definitely that data that exists that can show at an area or at an encampment, an unsanctioned encampment, there is this kind of crime increase or these kinds of negative kinds of things around public health and public safety. Yeah, obviously, we've actually had to clean up because of that. We've obviously had crimes like shootings, homicides occur at encampments. I will generally say that's why I've said unsheltered encampments, unsanctioned encampments are unsafe, and they cannot be allowed to just persist without mitigation, because sometimes some very bad things happen.
Thanks for that. And the fact that the camping ban is in place means pitching the tent itself is also a crime. So that creates a lot of complexity. Terrence, were you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, my follow-up is when you have information related to criminality or criminal acts at an encampment, do you all does public safety, mainly DPD, proactively respond to that, or is it something where you just kind of like, we'll wait to see what happens?
No, we proactively respond, and we proactively do things like do an encampment cleanup or do things like that. And depending on the behavior, we may even do things like if it's open drug use or drug activity or drug dealing, we will target operations there where we're making enforcement efforts around that, to the point where there's search warrants conducted on encampments, just like there would be at a house that's selling drugs. There's a tent that's selling drugs, same thing. So yeah, there's definitely deliberate things that police are trying to do. We have a daily meeting with these groups where every response around the city is trying to mitigate this. The problem is that the complexity of the problem, as the mayor recognized, is it's so large, right? We have so many people in an unhoused situation. And then we also have a police department that's understaffed. And then we have an increasing call volume on lots of other things like auto theft and violent crime that's not associated with encampments that we're also responding to. So I think, and what I'm excited about in our House 1000 is hopefully this will give us a better opportunity to, when we have criminal activity, and we could focus our limited resources more directly at those problems with crime at these locations.
Okay, any other questions for?
I appreciate the time with everyone. I hope I got all your questions answered. Obviously, if you need any more, please let me know, and Daniel can send them over for me. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
the extra time
Thank you.
today.
No problem.
Recognizing we have about 8 minutes to potentially have an executive session, I think that's maybe not our best use. And so, Monitor Castle, if it's okay with you, maybe we make sure we have an extended period of time for our executive session next meeting. Okay. And any other board business, any matters that folks want to cover before I close us out today?
I just want to tell Terrence that I will be over shortly for a photo session.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Yeah. You know what's funny? Stefan's office is really like a stone's throw from where I live. I mean, I can actually see his office from my balcony.
There you go. Photo
Okay.
pending. Well, Daniel, then we're not ready to publish the brochure because we need one more picture of Stefan in it. Okay, well, thanks everyone for the meeting today. Appreciate it. And
everybody else is welcome to show up to the community events, so it's not so I'm not focused on.
I only show up to settings where there's like really boring office walls behind, so it's not available for me. All right, well, thanks everyone, and see you in a couple of weeks. Appreciate the discussion today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.